The year is 1970. Apollo 13 is the third mission meant to land on the moon. Little did the crew know, sitting on the launch pad waiting for the blue touch paper to be lit, that their mission would turn into a fight of life and death. Let's get into this. In April 1970, the world held its breath as NASA did the seemingly impossible by bringing home 3 astronauts in a crippled spacecraft by slingshotting them around the moon and returning them safely to Earth. The story of Apollo 13 has been a box office smash, with Tom Hanks uttering those immortal famous words.
Houston, we have a problem.
That sentence is not quite right. What was actually said was, Houston, we've had a problem. Minor semantics, I know, but that's Hollywood glamorising it for you, and here at Everything Space we like to put the facts straight. It was just over a year since Apollo 11 had landed on the moon, and with the success of Apollo 12, Apollo 13 wasn't just about landing on the moon. Apollo 13 carried an array of scientific experiments which were going to be carried out during this mission. On board was a seismometer, which would measure the impact of the lunar lander as it landed on the moon. They also had a heat flow experiment, where 2 of the crew would step outside and drill 3 holes in the lunar surface, about 3 meters deep, and measure the temperatures at the bottom. They also had some other experiments on board, which would measure protons and electrons, as well as taking samples of the lunar atmosphere and measuring for dust particles. The original crew of Apollo 13 were Jim Lovell, Fred Haise and Ken Mattingly. However, Ken was swapped out for Jack Swigert 2 days before launch due to being exposed to German measles, and not having it as a child, it wasn't worth the risk. Apollo 13 blasted into the sky on the 11th of April at 2:13 p.m, but the mission started to go wrong straight away. The second stage burn during launch cut out almost 2 minutes too soon. This was due to pogo oscillation, or in layman's terms, extreme vibration. However, the third stage burned longer to compensate for this, and they hit orbit almost dead on. Now in orbit, the crew spent the next 2 hours doing checks to make sure that the ship was ready to go. Now good to go, they fired the third stage engine one final time for the translunar injection, or the path to the moon. Now they were on the way to the moon, Jack Swigert took control of the spacecraft to carry out the transposition manoeuvre. This is where the command module separates from the third stage booster, does a 180-degree turn and extracts the LEM, or Aquarius, from the third stage booster. Once this procedure is completed, the crew can settle in for the 3-day trip to the moon. On the 3rd day of the mission, the crew took part in a broadcast which was used to show people back on Earth around the spacecraft. But little did the crew know, while the broadcast was taking place, that most of the major networks back on Earth had actually dropped it due to falling ratings. After the broadcast had taken place, Jack Swigert was asked by NASA to stir the O2 tanks. 95 seconds after Swigert had flipped the switch to stir the O2 tanks, there was an almighty explosion which rocked the ship. Comms and power momentarily cut out. This is when Jim Lovell uttered those famous words.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
5 guidance.
Go guidance.
We've had a hardware restart. I don't know what it was.
Okay. Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main B bus undervolt.
Warning lights started to flash, indicating that the O2 levels were dropping, and this is when Jim Lovell noticed through the window a gas venting into space.
Yeah, that's because of the AC, and it looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something. We are venting something out into space.
With power levels dropping in the command module, the NASA boffins had decided to use Aquarius, the lunar lander, as a sort of lifeboat. Lovell and Hayes moved very quickly and managed to power up the lunar lander, Aquarius, in less than 3 hours. Once all the crew had moved into the lunar lander, the main command module was shut down to conserve power for re-entry back into Earth's atmosphere. Now the immediate danger had passed, decisions had to be made on ways and means of bringing the spacecraft back to Earth. NASA came up with two options. One, a direct abort, which basically meant turn the vehicle around, head for home, or the second option, which was to slingshot around the moon. NASA decided to use the second option and slingshot around the moon, a lot safer, because a direct abort would require the command module using its main engine to head back to Earth, and unfortunately from the explosion they weren't sure what kind of damage was done, and it just was not worth the risk. "61 hours and 29 minutes into the mission, the descent engine on the lunar lander would have to be lit for 34.23 seconds. This was so that the spacecraft could be put back on course to get back to Earth in 4 days. As Apollo 13 rounded the dark side of the moon, comms were lost. This gave the crew time to reflect on what could have been. However, there is a silver lining to this mission. The crew now hold the record for the furthest men from Earth at 248,655 miles, and this is a record that is still held today. As morning broke in the United States, all the news networks and newspapers were reporting on the perilous mission and what had happened to Apollo 13. Now homeward bound, the crew decided to settle in and had to power down the lunar module systems to conserve power. They knew it was going to get a bit chilly, but that was going to be the least of their problems on the journey home. The lunar module was only designed for a crew of 2. Carbon dioxide levels started to rise. At the rate the levels were rising, the crew would not make it back to Earth. There were 2 issues with the CO2 scrubbers on the lunar module. The first being that they were only designed to support 2 crew members for 2 days on the lunar surface. And the second issue was that in the lunar module the CO2 scrubbers were round, but on the command module they were square. So the boffins at NASA had to come up with a way of making the square modules fit in a round hole, and only using what was available on the spacecraft. After some hours of trial and error, the boffins cracked it and transmitted the instructions to the crew on Apollo 13. Using only the backs of folders, pipes, duct tape, plastic bags, the crew managed to make an adapter, and after a short period of time the CO2 levels started to drop and the crew could breathe easily again. As Apollo 13 neared Earth, the conditions on board had deteriorated. The crew were having to ration their water and living in temperatures of 3 degrees Celsius. Fred Hayes had contracted a painful urine infection, and all 3 crew members had lost 14 kilograms of weight between them. Earlier we spoke about Ken Mattingly, who was the guy who got pulled off the mission 2 days before launch and replaced with Jack Swigert. Well, this is where he now came into play in getting the Apollo 13 crew back home. Knowing the Apollo systems like the back of his hand, he spent many hours in the simulator working out a procedure to power up the command module systems again, using as little power as possible. He also found out while doing this that he did not have measles. An hour before re-entry, the crew moved back into the command module. Once in the command module, they worked on the procedure that Ken had passed up to them to power up the module. Once they had fully powered up, they sealed the hatches and jettisoned the lunar module, which would then burn up in the atmosphere. They then jettisoned the rear section of the command module, and when this happened, this would be the first time they would be able to see the damage which the explosion had caused a few days before. The whole of the right hand side of the rear section of the command module was damaged right up to the heat shield. There were concerns that the heat shield may have been damaged. However, nothing could be done about this now, and just had to cross their fingers and hope and pray. During re-entry, there's usually a 4-minute comms blackout. This is to do with ionisation in the atmosphere. 4 minutes came, and 4 minutes passed. Nothing. 5 minutes came, and NASA had started to wonder if the heat shield had failed. Just over 6 minutes had now passed, and then Jim's voice came over the radio. All of a sudden, the whole world broke into celebration.
Odyssey Houston standing by, over.
Okay, go over.
Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Apollo 13, this is recovery, over. They're going through 5,000. Under Apollo 13, this is recovery, and your chutes look good. Apollo 13, this is recovery. We observed your RCS burn, over. The recovery, Apollo 13 is descending. Apollo 6, this is recovery, over. Photo 1 spliced in at this time. The three chutes are displaced in the water. 0 degrees, magnetic 3.5 miles. He will come up. You and you, Roger. This Photo 1, the command module is stable 1 at this time. They're riding comfortably. The vertical axis are approximately 15 degrees.
If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to comment. Until next time, goodbye.